You ever have a situation where you come across a word, you say, I'm going to have to look that up sometime and find out what that really means? For years and years, I've been reading about the various peoples that you encounter in the Old Testament, and one name keeps coming up, and I could never figure out who they were. Like I knew who the Elamites were. They were from Elam, and I knew where the Hittites were from. They're from Hittite. And I go through the Moabites were from Moab. You could always find a place where, but then I came across the word the Amorites, and I didn't know where Amor was. So I finally decided to, just the other day, to find out for sure just what that word Amor actually means. The Amorites are an ancient Semitic speaking people from Syria who occupied large parts of the southern Mesopotamia from the 21st century to the end of the 17th century. In other words, it was not a place, it was a people. It was a way they described certain people. There was another definition I had that an Amorite is a member of a semi-nomadic people living in Mesopotamia, Palestine, Syria, and in the third millennium, founders of the ancient city of Mari on the Euphrates. The next slide shows a little bit more about that. It shows this is Mari. Mari at one time was a very important city in that part of the world. It was sort of a commercial center because there are a lot of important roads that went right through there, highways that went through there. But Amorites could be found in Canaan, they can be found in Syria here, and there actually were quite a few Amorites that showed up in Mesopotamia, in Samaria. A semi-nomadic people. That's an interesting description right at the beginning. Here is a look at the journeys of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And one of the things that's very characteristic, particularly of Abraham and of Jacob, is that they're moving all the time, semi-nomadic. Isaac, somewhere in here we find that Isaac stays put. He doesn't go very far from Beersheba to Hebron. But Abraham and Jacob move, and they move quite a bit. So you might ask, are they semi-nomadic? Could it possibly be that the Amorites might be associated with them? Well, then you go back to the scriptures and you read in Genesis 11, it says that Terah, now that's the father of Abraham, he took Abram his son and Lot the son of Haran, his son's son, and Sarah his daughter-in-law, and his son's wife's wife, and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan, and they came to Haran and dwelt there. Now, that's something I grew up with. I think a lot of other people have grown up with. And if we go back to this previous slide, it would indicate that Abraham, or Terah, and his family went from Ur of the Chaldees, which is way down here in Sumer, one of the principal cities of Sumer, way down here in Mesopotamia, and went all the way up to Haran, way up here. That was a movement that he made. Let's get back to this. That's what it says here. That's what had taken place. There is one little problem about that, is that Ur of the Chaldees had fallen to the Elamites about 200 years before Abraham comes on the scene. And there's no way that Abraham or Terah could have come from Ur of the Chaldees. Now, in future weeks, I'm going to be talking quite a bit about the history of that period, but it's a pretty well-known fact that around 2000 BC, about 200 years before Abraham comes on the scene, that the whole Mesopotamia valley was conquered by the Elamites, and they destroyed so many things that, well, actually, there is what they call the Lamentations of Ur. There are several bits of literature that talk about how extreme was the fact that Ur and all these other cities had been destroyed. Yet, what we read in our Bibles that Abraham's father came from Ur of the Chaldees, but he couldn't have. That led some folks to come up with the next slide. Terah's family were definitely not Sumerian. There's no way they could have been Sumerian. If they weren't Sumerian, could it very well be that they were what? Amorites. They were a nomadic people that moved from one place to another place from that part of the world. This particular section that I copied precisely it was on the internet was very important. It says Terah's family were not Sumerian. They had long identified with the very people, the Amorites, whom Mesopotamian tradition blamed for Ur's downfall. What is more, as depicted in the Bible, the details of, I did these italics, the details of the patriarch's tribal organization, naming, conventions, family structure, customs of inheritance, and land tenure, genealogy schemes, and other things are typical of the Amorites. In other words, the Bible, as it describes Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, is described in exactly the way these Amorites behaved, not the way the Sumerians behaved. Now let's keep in mind who the Sumerians were. The Sumerians were the people that we often attribute as being one of the first civilized societies that we have in the Western world. We know that there are others that were prior to them, but as far as the Western world is concerned, we can say that civilization or society got started around 3000 BC, and the Sumerians were very instrumental. One of the reasons that the Bible said that Terah came from Ur of the Chaldees is that it was not realized for many centuries that Terah could not have come from Ur because it was not there. They didn't know that much about the history to be able to realize that. To make matters worse, and that is that the word Chaldees has absolutely nothing to do with something that concerns Ur, the Chaldees. Chaldees talks about a region that's way up north. And the word never was used until about 900 BC, about 100 years after David. In other words, things aren't meshing very well. And that led to the conclusion that we really have to consider Terah's family not as being from Sumeria, but probably were the, Amorites. Another reason is this, is if you take a look at Ur of the Chaldees, and it says that he was going to go to Canaan, why did he not take the shortest route? Why did he end up taking a route way up here? The answer is he wouldn't have. He would have taken the shortest route. He would not have gone right straight across the desert because it's Arabian desert you can't get across. But he could have gone through this section here. But he didn't do it. Let's take a look at the next slide. If you take a look at the next slide, you can take a look at Abraham's journey in a somewhat different fashion. Most of it is taking place right in this region here. This slide is like, can you read this up here? You see this URBA, is it?
URFA.
Urba. You know what that is translated? Ur of the Chaldees. In a different. Actually, that is a city that's right next to Haran. And very likely, it could have been that Terah and Abraham and his family came from this city. That doesn't sound too ridiculous, particularly when we find out that the Muslims regarded the fact in their Bible, in their translation of Genesis, that Abraham and Terah did not come from Ur the Chaldees in Mesopotamia, but actually came from this little city that's above Haran. According to the Jewish and Muslim sources, Urfa is Ur-Kasdim, the hometown of Abraham, the grandfather of Jacob, whom God named Israel. The identification was questioned. Well, anytime anything new is discovered, people are going to question it. And the man they questioned it was a fellow named Woolley, because he had established earlier, way back in 1927, that Ur was in Mesopotamia. Let me get another slide here again. Thinking about these things, I had a couple of questions. that I wondered if they couldn't possibly be answered if we knew a little bit more about where Abraham had actually come from. And these are the questions that I formulated. This question was formulated this morning. Why are the Israelites so prominent among the Amorites in the Old Testament? They are mentioned so many times. Well, because if Abraham and his family were Amorites, yes, they would be mentioned. But the Israelites are unique. They have a history. None of the other Amorites have that. They have a history. The question that could be asked next: what are the factors that make this history so unique? Their history is centered on just two factors, and this is what we look at when we look at the Bible. One of them is the relationship that they had with God, and the other was an event in their history. Now, this is very true about the Israelites. They were very concerned about their God, but what is this event in their history that made them unique, that made the Israelites feel that they were different, and that they had a history that made them, as Amorites, different from all the other Amorites? Simply this: although they spent centuries, maybe 2 or 3 more in Egypt. Now, I want to mention something. I have not mentioned the word Egypt once. I was very careful not to mention it until now. But the fact that they were in Egypt for 2 or more centuries, and they were brought up out of Egypt and led to the promised land, the land promised to their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. All of a sudden, well, we find something rather fascinating, and then Egypt comes into play. Egypt is mentioned another time in Genesis, and that is that when Abraham first came into Canaan, he and Sarah went down to Egypt because there was a famine, but they didn't stay there very long. They came back up into Canaan. Otherwise, Egypt is not mentioned at all in the book of Genesis until we get to what? Chapter 37. There are still another 13 chapters left in Genesis, and they're all concerned with what? All the time that the Israelites spent in Egypt. And then what we find is that almost a fourth of the book of Genesis actually takes place not in Canaan, not in Mesopotamia, but actually takes place in Egypt. It takes place in Egypt because of certain events that had occurred that were rather significant. Let's take a quick look at that. Exodus 20. Does anybody recognize where Exodus 20 comes from? That's where you get the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments start out this way: and God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. One of the commentaries that I was reading saying that this is one of the few places in the Old Testament where these letters, these words could have been written in red ink, just as we do in the New Testament with the things that Jesus said, because this is what God actually said, spoke to the Israelites. Where do we find about how they got into Egypt? It starts in chapter 37 of Genesis. Chapter 37 deals with one thing that we're going to look at rather carefully today. There's a chapter 38 that we'll be covering a little bit differently next year because it deals with something quite unusual. But when we get to chapter 39, we find out it starts out with Joseph is in Egypt. Joseph, who? The youngest son of Abraham. Joseph is in Egypt, and he's a slave in Egypt. But let's look at this once. This is Genesis 37. Jacob dwelt in the land of his father's sojourning. That's where Jacob had been, in the land of Canaan. And this is the history of the family of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, keep that date in mind, was shepherding the flock with his brothers. He was a lad. He was a lad with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. Those are the two servant girls, the father's wives. And Joseph brought back an ill report of them to their father. I'm sorry, we have no indication of what that ill report is, other than the fact that Joseph, as the youngest son, would go out and visit his brothers and say, some of these kids are not behaving themselves. What do you call Joseph when he does something like that? He's a tattletale. He was telling on him. But it turned out, now, Israel loved Joseph more than any of the other children because he was a son of his old age, and he made him a long robe with sleeves. Not only was he a son of his old age, but he was the only son that he had up to that time from Rachel, the girl that he loved. He had sons from Leah and Bilhah and Zilpah, but he finally had a son from Rachel. And he made him, gave him a cloak with long sleeves. But when his brothers saw their father loved him more than his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Let me take a look at the next slide. Here is Jacob putting on the cloak with long sleeves. What else do you see? You learned about this as a cloak of what? Of many colors. Go to your Bible, go to your NIV. It doesn't say many colors, it says long sleeves. The many colors come from the fact that in the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the book of Genesis, then it talks about a coat of many colors, and then guess what? The King James used it, and consequently most of us English-speaking people are more familiar sometimes with the King James Version, so we think that actually what he got was a coat of many colors. But actually it was a coat of long sleeves, and I thought that was kind of interesting when I looked into that. What is the significance of these long sleeves? It was a significance that he was of a higher status than his brothers. His brothers worked out in the field. They did not have long sleeves, they had short sleeves. Let me ask you a question. If you were to go into the shop in a factory and you looked at all the workers with their short sleeves, and somebody came through wearing a white shirt and a tie, would you know who the boss was? The same thing was indicated when you had a person wearing long sleeves. He did not have to participate in manual labor the same way his brothers did. So what we have is a situation that I think shows up pretty nicely in this particular slide of Jacob putting this cloak on to Joseph, and here are his brothers. Can you see they are not happy with him? They are not happy at all. I got several pictures of this. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream which I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered round it and bowed down to my sheaf." Here is Joseph talking to his brothers and telling them about this dream where he had the sheaves. I guess how many sheaves are there? There are 10 sheaves, the 10 brothers, and there's Joseph, and what are the sheaves doing? The sheaves are bowing down to him. This brother said to him, are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to have some dominion over us? So they hated him yet more than for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers. And he said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream, and behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me." And when he told his father and his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow down ourselves to the ground before you?" Here's another one of the dreams. Actually, there were more pictures of him dreaming the dream of the sun, the moon, and the stars than of the sheaves. His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the sayings in his mind. Now his brothers went to pasture in their father's flock near Shechem. Now Shechem, we were talking about the last few weeks. That's that city that's up in Ephraim, in the area of Ephraim. His brothers were, that's where Jacob lived for about 15 to 20 years. And the brothers were pasturing sheep. And Israel said to Joseph, are your brothers not pasturing the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send you to them. And he said to him, here I am. So he said to him, go now, see if it is well with you and your brothers and with the flock, and bring word again to him. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. Now, when I started on this chapter 37, I had something entirely different in mind to talk about. And part of it comes from here. It comes from the fact that we're told that Jacob sent Joseph up from Hebron up to Shechem. That is a trip of 52 miles. And we are told that Joseph is only 17 years old at the time. Is this a behavior of a responsible father? What we're going to find out, and I will point this out every once in a while, when I go through this scripture as we have it in Genesis 27, as we find it in the Bible, there are things that conflict. They don't seem to fit together. This doesn't fit very well that he sent him up from the valley of Hebron. What was he doing way down in Hebron, 50 miles away from Shechem, and sending Joseph all the way up there? It's only one instance where there seems to be some sort of conflict of that sort. At any rate, Jacob sends Joseph up there. And when Joseph got up there near Shechem, and a man found him wandering around in the fields, and the man asked him, what are you seeking? He said, I'm seeking my brothers. And he said, tell me, I pray you, where are they pasturing the flock? And the man said, they have gone away, for I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them up in Dothan. Dothan is about 5 or 10 miles north of Shechem. They weren't a long ways away. That's a long ways from Hebron. But it would make much better sense, if we stop and think about it for a moment, that Joseph was 17 at this time. And if he was a 17 at that time, it made very good sense that he might have had brothers that were pasturing sheep in the neighborhood of Shechem, because that's where they were living at that time. When those brothers saw him, they saw him afar off. And before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said one to another, here comes the dreamer. Now, come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say that a wild beast has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams. In other words, they conspired to do what? Do away with him. But now it says, but when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, let's not take his life. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood, cast him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him. So he rescued him out of their hand, and so that he could restore him to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the long robe with sleeves that he wore, and they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty, and there was no water in it. There are things that artists like, and there are any number of pictures I could find of Joseph being cast into the pit. This is the one that really shows it in a way. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, and with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, what profit is it for us to slay our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hands be on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And he and his brothers hated him. Judah said this. Well, I'm not so sure, but in the other Bible, it says that Reuben said it. But in the other translation, it says that Judah said it. Now, all of a sudden, we get a conflict. It's one of these things that led some of the people in the 1800s to reach the conclusion that the book of Genesis, like some of the other books in the, particularly the books in the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, were from different sources. That some of these sources that we find in chapter 37 are sources that may have come from what we call the Yahweh source, where the Yahweh is interested in what happens in the tribe of Judah. The other source is the Elohim source. The Elohim source is the source to the north, and they are the ones that were centered around Shechem, and they would be interested in the tribes that were to the north. Well, Reuben is one of those that's in a tribe from the north. Judah is one of those that's in a tribe from the south. And what was concluded was that a lot of the material that we have in the book of Genesis, as well as Numbers and in parts of Exodus, are conflations. Conflations are where they took the Yahweh source and they took the Elohim source and made one source out of them. Now this presents some problems because those sources were not identical. Now how are you going to do this and still make everybody happy that you're using their source? The consequence is that you run into some of these conflicts, and that's not the end of these conflicts at all. As a matter of fact, take a look at this word, the Ishmaelites, what should we do? They sold them to the Ishmaelites. Keep that Ishmaelites in mind, because guess what's going to happen? We're going to find out. The Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites. What is the Ishmaelites or the? Actually, this is one of the verses where they conflated both the Elohim and the Elohim. They got both of them involved. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he rent his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, "The lad is gone, and where shall I go?" It's kind of interesting to hear about Reuben at this point. Do you recall last week we talked about the fact that after the story that we have in Shechem of Dinah being kidnapped and raped and then arranged to be married, that there's a real conflict between the people in Shechem and Jacob and his family. And Jacob had to leave Shechem and goes down south. And when they're on the way south, they find, we read, this is what we did last week in chapter 35 of Genesis, we read how when they had left Bethel, Rachel died. That's important. Rachel died. And then right after that we had that verse that Reuben went into Rachel's tent, or went to Rachel's maid, and he slept with Rachel's maid, and Reuben became persona non grata as far as the Old Testament was concerned. Yet in chapter 37 we read about Reuben doing good things. Well, this probably happened before they ever left Shechem, when Reuben was still in good faith or in good standing with the rest of the tribe. But let's take a look at the thing that. Well, this is Jacob Joseph being taken out of the pit and sold to the Ishmaelites. Here we see them actually bargaining for the amount. They got some money for Joseph. See Joseph in the background being led away to do what? They took Joseph's robe and killed a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. And they sent the long robe with sleeves and brought it to his father and said, "This we have found. See now how whether it is your son's robe or not." And he recognized it and said, "This is my son's robe. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." And here we have some pictures of Jacob seeing this torn, bloody robe. 3 different pictures that we have. Whoops. And then Genesis 37 stops at this point. Then Jacob rent his garments and put sackcloth upon his loins, and mourned for his sons many days. And all his sons and his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. No, he said, no, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning. Thus his father wept for him. The last verse in chapter 37. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold him to Egypt, to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. Now, what is the purpose of chapter 37? Well, one purpose might be is to give us an indication of how in the world we end up with the Israelites in Egypt. The Israelites ended up in Egypt because Joseph, the favorite son of Jacob, was sold as a slave to the Egyptians. What we find, except for chapter 38, the rest of what we have in the book of Genesis all takes place in Egypt, and it's all centered around Joseph. It's all centered around Joseph. Now, there are addendum. When I sent out this to Carl to have sent to you so that you can see what the slides are going to be, this was on Wednesday. That was long before I had gotten into some of the material I covered earlier. And in that addendum, I had this great big long section, which I'm also including again, a section on the documentary hypothesis. Now you may wonder why. Well, it's everything that we talked about last week concerning the documentary hypothesis, how you can look at these different sources, you can look at these books and see that the writing that we have in these books come from these different sources. Eventually they end up in the Torah, which are the 5 books, because we have a Yahweh source, we have an Elohim source, they get combined. Now that's exactly what happened in chapter 37. They were combined into J-E source. A priestly source, which was written sometime later, is combined with it, and then with the help of a redactor, these different sources were put together along with the Deuteronomic source to give the Torah. We'll talk about Deuteronomy some other time in the future. But this little part of this little diagram is worth keeping in mind, that we have the Yahweh source. Why is it called J? Did you remember from last week? Unless you watched. J stands for the German Yahweh. The Germans do not have a Y, they have a J. And so J stands for Yahweh, E stands for Elohim. The J-E source is a conflation. I looked up that word. It's a real word in the dictionary. It means to combine 2 written sources. The conflation is what is combined with the priestly source and then put into the Torah or put into the books of Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Whoops. These are the things that I left in the thing that was so that you can look at the different things concerning these different sources. And this is what we did last week, taking a look how we could find all 3 sources being represented in the times that there were what you call times when Jacob actually was confronted by God. But we did that last week. This is an appendix. As you can see, I copied this from a book that was not hardbound, and it was hard to lie flat on the screen. These are all the different sources, the Yahweh, the Elohim, the priestly source, and the redactor. And these are all the different parts of Genesis that involve these particular sources. Now, why did I include this? Because what I'm going to show you next, we just went through chapter 37. Well, I want to show you chapter 37 again, but this time it's going to be in color. And I'm going to indicate what are the Elohim sources, and what are the Yahweh sources, and what are the priestly sources. The only priestly source we have the first 2 verses, but from there on in, we actually find indication, Elohist being a part of a verse, and the Yahwist being another part of the verse. And then another story comes. This is all Yahwist. And there we have a situation. This is a kind of an interesting one. In the Yahweh source, remember the dreams that Joseph had? He dreamed of the sheaves of wheat. The Yahwist talks about dreams, the dreams being sheaves of wheat bowing down to Joseph. In the Elohist source, it talks about the sun and the moon and the stars. And that's rather typical of the Elohist writings. They're always a little bit more esoteric. And consequently, this particular passage was assigned to them. But you'll notice as we go through, we see the conflation. Now, I have included that in what was sent to you folks, thinking that maybe some of you would like to look at that and go through some of the things that I've mentioned, see if you can't look at some of the things that are in that index and see where some of these things show up. I won't go through that. I was planning to do that at one time. I want to do something a little bit different, though, and that is point out something that I think is rather significant. And that is simply this, that the rest of the book of Genesis all takes place in Egypt. It all takes place in Egypt. Why is that so terribly important that it takes place in Egypt? I've got to go all the way back to the beginning here. Oddly enough, something is missing. What is missing is the thing that makes the Israelites different from the Amorites, is that they had a history. They had a history. None of the others had a history. They had not only had a history, but it was a recorded history. It's recorded in some of those sources that we use for the Torah. What was unique about this history? Well, there were two things that were really unique about the history. One of them that is the most important of all is that they accepted the fact that they were a people because they had a God. They worshiped one God. And their history is always going to be given to us in terms of their relationship with God. The other thing is that this God played a very significant role in one of the important events in the history of the Israelites. When we look at the history of the Israelites, we find out that one thing they keep referring to is one thing. And on the other flash drive, I would have this. And what it refers to is something that we read in the book of Exodus. Exodus 20. How many of you recognize Exodus 20? That's the beginning of the Ten Commandments. And the beginning of the Ten Commandments, I have a slide that says that I am the Lord your God that brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of bondage. And from there on in, we find that that is one of the telling features of everything that the Israelites do, is looking on the fact that their God had taken them out of Egypt, out of slavery. It doesn't say this in Genesis, and then led them to the land that was promised to them through their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In other words, what we find in Exodus and in Numbers of how the Israelites came from Egypt and came into Palestine. Those are very significant parts of the history of they're significant parts of the Bible, and they are the important parts of the history of the Israelites, which made them unique in that fashion. Now, one of the things that helped an awful lot is what we have in the book of Genesis. And that is that we have so much material in the book of Genesis. Almost 25% of the book of Genesis takes place in Egypt, centered around one person, Joseph. Not Abraham, not Jacob, but Joseph. All centered around Joseph. And what is the reason for this? This is what I'll try to go through rather quickly. The reason for this is that in those chapters, starting with chapter 39 through chapter 50 in Genesis, we hear about the things that happened in Egypt, and we get one of the most fantastic bits of literature you'll find in any language at any period of time. It is almost incredible when you think of how much is included in there, and I'm going to summarize it because we're going to be looking at it very much more carefully. A little bit of it we looked at in chapter 37. We find out in chapter 37 a family conflict, namely that Jacob favored one son over the other sons, and there was a conflict between the brothers. When we get to chapter 39, we find something that's rather essential in all good stories, a big sexual content. He runs into Potiphar's wife, where it looks like he's going to be seduced by Potiphar's wife. And then what happens to him? He gets thrown into jail. And what does he do when he's in jail? He starts interpreting dreams. And he was able to interpret dreams correctly. Dreams of the butler and of the baker. He interpreted them correctly. And he's still in jail. The way he interpreted them, it was that the butler was actually going to be set free. And the butler went to, again, serve Pharaoh. And suddenly, he remembered Joseph, because guess what? Pharaoh has dreams, and he cannot understand the dreams. So what happens is that his butler says, hey, I had this friend in prison who can interpret dreams. Let's get this fellow out of prison. So after 2 years' time, Joseph is sprung from prison, is in front of Pharaoh. This gets to us about chapter 42. It's in front of Pharaoh, and he interprets those dreams. Predicting that there's going to be years of bounty as far as the crops, as far as the harvest is concerned, followed by years of famine. And what Joseph does is he tells Pharaoh, what you should do is you should prepare. You should prepare for this. Get ready for the fact that the famine is going to follow this. Those 7 years of plenty, then 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh is so impressed with what Joseph has to say in interpreting his dreams, he makes him second in command of Egypt. Now, does that sound like a far-fetched story that he'd go from prison to the prime minister of Egypt? When we get to this, I'm going to go into this much more thoroughly and show you that up until maybe about the 1700s in the Christian era, this was just accepted as fact. But now with what we know from modern archaeology and what we know about the history of that period, it seems to be a rather acceptable idea that Joseph could very well have suddenly been appointed as prime minister. And you want to know something? That's only the beginning of the story. Because now the story starts to get interesting. Because when the famine hits, guess what? Joseph's brothers and his father back in Canaan are suffering from the famine. And if they want any food, what are they going to have to do? They're going to have to go down to Egypt. Now these brothers do not know that Joseph was a slave in Egypt. For all they know, Joseph was dead. But now these brothers have to go down and face Joseph. So what is Joseph going to do? Now this is where I find the book of Genesis gets absolutely fascinating, because even Alfred Hitchcock or any of the Hollywood producers could not have come up with a scenario like this. When these brothers come up, they don't recognize Joseph, and Joseph doesn't recognize them. And he plays with them. He doesn't let them know that he's alive. And we get two or three of the more interesting chapters that we find in the Bible of how Joseph and his brothers were parlaying this such thing. One of the things that Joseph finds out is that he has a brother that was born to Rachel. He has a brother named Benjamin. He did not even know that brother existed, but now he knows that he has a brother. Just to show you how well the Yahwist and the Elohist put this all together, that when that brother is brought up there, much to Jacob's dismay, when that brother is brought up there, guess what? One of Joseph's silver cups is missing, and it's determined that somebody has stolen it. Well, it wasn't stolen. Joseph planted it. And guess where he planted it? He planted it in the sack of the person that will be found guilty if it's found. Guess whose sack he plants it in? In Benjamin's sack, in his brother Benjamin's sack. Like I say, this is literature that's beyond all compare. Finally, Joseph makes himself known to his brothers, and he forgives his brothers, and there's a great reunion. And one of the things that results from the reunion is that they are to go back to Jacob, and take Jacob and the rest of their family and come and live in Egypt. And so they do. Jacob and his group migrate from Canaan. They migrate down into Egypt, where the son of Jacob, Joseph, is actually the prime minister of that part of Egypt, and they're living with rather important people in Egypt. You get to Genesis, from Genesis to Exodus. One of the first verses that you find in the book of Exodus says, there came a Pharaoh in Egypt that did not remember Joseph. And all of a sudden what we find is that the Israelites, which were brought down into Egypt, are now in favor with the Egyptian government, and they were made slaves, possibly for as many as 200 or 300 years. This is what we're going to be covering in the book of Genesis, and then looking at some of the things that we have in the books of Numbers and Exodus, of how the Israelites got out of Egypt with the help of God and got to the promised land. We will not be getting to this until next week. As I said before, I don't think there's anybody in Hollywood that could come up with a scenario quite like that. I've often thought what a great movie this would make if they could make this movie and do it with the idea of making it look like real people and not a movie with everybody saying thee and thou and hanging a lot of Bible baggage on it, by showing what kind of a conflict there must have been between Joseph and his brothers when they did not know that this man that was persecuting him was the man that they had kidnapped themselves and sold into slavery. My time is up. That's 45 minutes. And I was told that the chief started at 12 o'clock. Okay?